Due Process, recipient of 6 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards.
I will be independent. I will not be pushed around. I will not be influenced.
When he came before the Senate, Peter Harvey was talking tough law enforcement. But can he live up to his own promise? And with his nomination at an impasse, will he win confirmation? The Attorney General designate in his first extended sit-down interview, up next on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
Hello, and welcome to Due Process. Our only guest on this special two-part edition, New Jersey Attorney General designate Peter Harvey, in his first sit-down interview since a divided state Senate shelved his nomination. I'm Raymond Brown, and we'll talk both this week and next about the politics and policies that have brought him to this point and about his plans for what may be the state's second most powerful office. But first, here's Sandy King.
Raymond, it's been a mostly great ride for Peter Harvey. Leaving a lucrative private practice may have meant a considerable cut in pay, but it also meant a high-profile year as First Assistant AG and Director of the Division of Criminal Justice. A year marked by mostly good press and some measurable successes. Overall indictments up 60%. Major narcotics charges nearly doubled. Corruption indictments nearly tripled. Insurance fraud indictments up over 140%. And a grateful governor glad to move him up.
He has served with distinction, great distinction, as the First Assistant Attorney General and Director of the Division of Criminal Justice. The latest milestones of a brilliant 20-year career. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to introduce the Attorney General designate, Peter Harvey.
Back in January, Peter Harvey was looking like a sure thing. A quick and easy, non-controversial confirmation seemed to be in the making.
I proudly vote yes.
Senator Gormley.
I'm going to vote yes. I think that independence is going to be a cornerstone.
Both sides of the aisle seemed to like this nomination. And last month, when the Senate committee took its vote, only one judiciary member voted no.
I think it best that at this time, another person outside of the current AG's office be appointed to serve as our Attorney General. Therefore, I respectfully vote no.
But earlier that day, Senator Martin, during questioning about alleged administration efforts to influence the parole board, had thrown down the gauntlet.
2 other members of the parole board have contacted me, and I've spoken to them directly, and they've indicated that there are problems that extend within the parole board, and they have been influenced by parties outside of the parole board.
And 4 days later, Harvey picked it up with an early morning visit to Martin's house by 2 investigators from the AG's office. They asked the senator to name names. When he refused, they served a subpoena.
We are all human beings. Human beings make mistakes.
But with Martin insisting it was no less than retaliation for his vote, a dumb mistake was what even some friends were calling Harvey's move.
And that one dumb mistake should not for one moment cloud a magnificent career as a public lawyer, as a private lawyer.
Attorney General Peter Harvey.
But Harvey's most ardent supporters say that in going after the information Martin claimed to have when he did, instead of waiting till after he was safely confirmed, Harvey's shown himself to be the independent, aggressive prosecutor without concern for politics or personal advancement that he told the committee he would be.
Senator, it may have been the case in the past that some persons who occupied the chair of Attorney General were interested in using the position to be something else. I am not. And so I don't need to curry favor with anybody, either in the legislature or even in the governor's office, because I want them to do me a favor one day.
And with the Senate now poised to vote again next month, Harvey remains the acting Attorney General. For now, insisting that the stalemate over his confirmation has not changed the priorities that he's set for his office.
I'm here to do the work, and whether you're acting or whether you're not acting, you have the same authority as Attorney General. So as I act on a daily basis, I always keep in mind that I'm a temporary custodian of power. That's it.
Harvey succeeds his friend David Sampson, who returns to private practice after just 1 year and a unique term of service, in which he virtually shared the office with his first assistant.
David said to me that we will serve together, that there would be no important decision made in the department without the both of us talking about it, thinking it through, and making the best decisions.
They are decisions that have run the gamut from insurance fraud.
They will be penalized as if they had 9 points on their license.
To counterterrorism.
We're going to have to focus on domestic security in ways that we never envisioned.
From consumer fraud and kiddie porn.
To patrol the internet to stop people from sending around child pornography.
To gangs and racial profiling by the state police, over whom the Attorney General has ultimate authority.
Can I tell you that no one is engaging in profiling? I can tell you that we don't see any objective evidence of it.
As for public corruption, Harvey again makes no attempt to be politically correct.
If you look over the past decade, you probably cannot name a single major complex case that in the area of political corruption or organized crime that the division brought and won.
And if Senator Martin had listened closely to Harvey's answers to his questions, he might have heard a kind of explanation for the actions that just 4 days later would enrage the senator and put the Harvey nomination in some jeopardy.
We will be thorough, we will be careful, we will be ethical, and where we can act based upon evidence, we will go wherever the evidence leads us.
General, you have made virtually no public comment on the Martin affair in the weeks since your confirmation got stalled, but lots of others have had plenty to say. We saw that even your supporters are tending to say you made a dumb mistake. Is that what you would call it?
It's certainly a mistake. One thing that you learn as you grow into these positions, and particularly that of Attorney General, is that how you perceive an act may not be how others perceive it. And in this instance, what we were trying to do is, of course, gather evidence as quickly as we could, but what I've come to realize is that you have to recognize how your act deals with how it's perceived by another person. For example, the act of asking a state senator questions and then serving a subpoena upon him might be viewed as intimidation, even though that is not what is intended.
You can understand that he says he feels that way.
Yeah, I certainly understand it. It wasn't intended to be that. It certainly was not intended to intimidate, threaten, or bully the senator in any way. What we were trying to do is treat everyone as an ordinary citizen and try to gather evidence as quickly as we could. I promised the Senate, and indeed the public, that we would do this work in corruption and other tasks as conscientiously, as quickly, as diligently as we could. But I think that certainly members of the legislature, and in this case particularly Senator Martin, was entitled to a little different protocol, such as a phone call or even a letter. And you live and you learn.
The question that sort of hangs in the air on the street is, why, when you were acting Attorney General, would you serve such a subpoena when you could have done so afterwards?
Well, I don't think about cases politically, and I don't think about the work politically. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to do for the team to have waited until after confirmation to approach Senator Martin or anybody else and get information. But I think my training is in the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's in the federal system. And the way I was trained in the Department of Justice was to go after information and evidence at the time when it is right to do so. But you know, I'm in a different environment here, and so I'm learning new things, and I'm growing.
Is there a critical change that you might make going forward in terms of your thinking process?
Well, the critical change is in circumstances like these where, say, a legislator is simply a witness, or certain other persons holding a certain stature in society are witnesses. You might approach them in just a different manner. You might contact them by telephone or by letter, and you might, instead of responding to your perception of an urgency, just handle it a little differently.
If you had it to do over, a telephone call, you think would have sufficed?
It certainly would have been the preferred course of action here.
And you probably would have been Attorney General instead of Acting Attorney General.
Yeah, that's true, but I don't really think that your status ought to determine what your conduct ought to be. You ought to try to do it as fairly and as devoid from political considerations as you can. But certainly in this instance, I think we would have approached it a little differently.
In terms of the general priorities of your office, the one question that I think might be unclear to some citizens in New Jersey is that there is obviously a continued concern about terrorism. We've tended to think of that as the province primarily of the federal government. The question is, does your office have a role, and if so, what is it?
Well, you know that Governor McGreevey signed an executive order establishing the Office of Counterterrorism. We have a very, very talented director, Sid Casperson, who spent well over 25 years in the FBI, and particularly in Middle Eastern and terrorist groups. We're trying to do a lot of different things in terrorism. First, we've got the Domestic Security Preparedness Task Force, which meets twice a month, and it's made up of various heads of departments in state government: transportation, public utilities, Department of Environmental Protection, and we discuss areas of concern in government and what government can do to better prepare ourselves in the event of a terrorist attack. We also have, as part of that group, an infrastructure advisory committee made up of 24 industry sectors, and those are chaired by people like Dennis Bone of Verizon and Al Copy of PSE&G, and we discuss issues of target hardening and also general preparedness in the private sector, because as we both know, the acts of terror, if they occur in New Jersey, will not be military targets. They will be civilian targets. So we have to be sure that the private sector is well prepared as well as government.
You know that critics would say that you have to talk about countering terrorism, but that in fact, A, you can't do much about it, and B, it's really a lot of feel good, reassure the public, public relations. What can you point to that's hard, meaningful, making a difference?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. Number one, we have identified 110 critical infrastructure here in the state of New Jersey, and we have implemented, in fact, the task force has issued an order directing that certain procedures be followed to bring all of those infrastructure into compliance with either federal standards or industry standards for target hardening and safety. Secondly, just as recently as 2 weeks ago, as chairman of the task force, I issued an order that Governor McGreevey signed, which directed that small aircraft in regional airports throughout New Jersey double lock their aircraft when they're not in use. Thirdly, we're about to embark upon a truck inspection program with the New Jersey State Police, in which we're going to stop at random tanker trucks and other kinds of commercial vehicles as they enter the state, not waiting until they get to tunnels and bridges. To make sure that the person driving the vehicle is the right person and the load being carried is the proper load, and to make sure, more importantly, that these vehicles aren't being stolen and being used and to explode somewhere in the state. So, and what you're going to see also is over the next 45 days, we're going to meet with all 21 county terrorism coordinators to talk to them about areas of concern in that particular county dealing with terrorism. So these are just some of the measures that we're implementing and have implemented to date.
Now, most people, when you talk about terrorism, think in terms of ideologically motivated violence, and probably everybody thinks they know what we're talking about. I've heard you talk, though, about a nexus publicly between hate crimes and terrorism, which is, at least to me, a novel notion, and one about which I guess some people would have some skepticism, but it's worth hearing. You think there's a connection, and it's one that you focused on.
Well, there's no question about it. Let me put it in this context. With the war in Iraq, we have to be concerned about two kinds of issues. One is we have people of Middle Eastern descent, Muslims, who live in New Jersey, and particularly large populations in certain areas, central New Jersey, as well as the Patterson area. And they will be subjected to reprisals because people don't distinguish Middle Eastern Americans from Middle Easterners, and sometimes we act ugly with people who have differences. Secondly, I think we have to be concerned about Jewish communities, synagogues, and other Jewish communities in the state, because there are those who would take reprisals against Jews in America, and particularly in New Jersey, because of the Middle Eastern conflict. So what we are seeing, and what we have definite evidence of in some respects, is segments of the Aryan nation expressing support and indeed encouragement for Al-Qaeda and Middle Eastern terrorists, with the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is absolutely ludicrous.
Coming back to Sandy's perspective, what's the concrete thing that your office and its subordinate agencies can do that isn't already being done by what is a massive and costly federal effort?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things we can do. One is that we can engage in a continuing dialogue with Middle Eastern groups as well as Jewish groups to identify areas of concern. I think we can also provide better security on the local level, using local police departments to protect synagogues, schools, whether the schools are Jewish schools or Muslim schools. But I think also we have to just alert the community to these issues, because more importantly than law enforcement, we need every citizen in the state to pay attention to terrorism and report things that are out of order and are suspicious.
Okay, General, you know that when you talk about increased surveillance of civilians, and particularly groups that don't speak popular language, that this raises the antenna of civil liberties people who say, here we go again. Are you afraid that in the name of domestic security that there will indeed be violation of individual rights, that unpopular speech gets put to the test in a way that perhaps is not popular? Are there risks here?
Oh, there's certainly risks, and we're trying to be very mindful of them. One of the risks is that in our zeal to protect ourselves from terrorism, and in our zeal to ferret out people we believe to be sympathizers with terrorist causes, that we overstep civil liberties and we overstep the bounds of due process and law.
And what controls do you put on that?
Well,
how do you stop that?
Number one, you train law enforcement. You have to reemphasize to law enforcement what the rules are with respect to surveillance, with respect to search and seizure, with respect to stopping people, so that they understand what they can and cannot do under an American system of laws. The second thing I think you do is you engage the various communities to participate with you and share information and share their concerns, because sometimes these differences are not necessarily from the perspective of civil liberties. Sometimes they're cultural differences. I mean, we need to know when we approach Muslims what is the appropriate protocol for engaging them in a dialogue, or even as something as simple as visiting somebody at their home. We need to know that.
This is a natural place for us to talk about profiling, an issue that's been critical to us on due process, critical to the whole state. There's been for the last several years an emerging consensus, bipartisan, including law enforcement, all branches of government, that there was a systemic problem that led to profiling of minorities on the Turnpike and the Parkway in particular, but more broadly. Is it your view that this problem of a systemic issue of profiling still exists, and particularly still exists in state police?
Well, I think as you frame it, the answer is no. I don't think there is a problem of systemic profiling in the New Jersey State Police. I think that's been confirmed by the federal monitors. At least in the last two monitor reports, the federal monitors have opined that they see no evidence of race-based stops occurring on any of the highways in New Jersey. Now, remember, the monitors come to this conclusion as a result of a couple of things. One, they look at motor vehicle stop reports. They also look at videotapes on a random basis, and they look at hundreds of them during every visit. And they examine the tapes to determine, and the reports to determine, what is the basis for the stop. Is it selective enforcement that is race-based, or is it based upon some objective violation of law? Secondly, in the decisions to stop particular motorists, has the discretion been exercised in a particular manner? And then thirdly, they look at the videotape to make sure that the motorist himself or herself is treated appropriately.
But General, even if the numbers are looking better, you know that there are those who would say that what you're saying is at best naive, that in fact a culture of bias that grew up in the state police over generations, and that your predecessors, governors of this state, the last state police superintendent, have said again and again is pervasive, is there, is a kind of cancer on the state of New Jersey. Suddenly it's disappeared. How do we square that with everything that even our officials have told us about profiling and this culture in the state police?
Well, I think that the way you square it is with time. For example, there are some who would argue that conditions in America on issues of race have not improved at all since the 1960s. There are some people who would argue that. Now, I dare to suggest to you that that's not the case, that there has been progress, and the progress has been gradual, slow in some instances, but nonetheless made. I think the same thing has happened in the New Jersey State Police. Progress has definitely been made in that organization over time. This organization is not where it was in December of 1999 when that consent decree was signed. It's just in a very different place.
What about a year ago when we had Joe Santiago here, then superintendent of the state police, told us that one of his greatest challenges was getting control of racial profiling, and he felt he hadn't done it yet.
Well, and contrast that with who may be the next superintendent of police, a person who does not have a record of attacking the question of profiling, but in fact, to be a credible candidate has to talk about a profound epiphany in the last couple of years.
Well, let me address them both. I do not share former Superintendent Santiago's view. I think that his view was born out of a different set of circumstances than mine. I think he saw the organization very differently than I did, and I dare say that he may not have understood, as I do, the kinds of reforms, systemic reforms that have been made in that organization and the kind of progress that has been made there.
And what about Ricky Fuentes? What about someone who as recently as 3 years ago went on record defending the very underpinnings of racial profiling in the state police, defending policies that across the board had been condemned by officials in the state of New Jersey? You were part of his selection process. I believe you didn't know about the paper that he'd written prior to his selection, of which you were a part. Now, how comfortable can you be with that choice?
I think that he's going to be a very good superintendent of the state police, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. I allow for the possibility that a person, man or woman, can alter their view over time. Now, you're talking about unpublished writings that are, in some instances, 2.5 to 3 years old, at a time period when he was at a certain level in the organization, where he saw the organization from a certain perspective, and at a time when the entire state was in denial about racial profiling. It wasn't just the state police, but you could identify segments of this state who were in denial about racial profiling.
3 years ago.
3 years ago, in denial about it.
I'm assuming that you'll be willing to come back with us and spend a whole program just on profiling. It's that important an issue.
I think it is important an issue, and about state police reform. I think we should talk about them both.
But since we're really running short for at least today, there was a Supreme Court opinion yesterday on cross-burning likely to affect, in your view, the duties of your office.
Well, I think it gives us comfort in knowing that we can prosecute persons who burn crosses on the lawns of other Americans where they do so to intimidate. The troubling aspect of this opinion is that the court struck down that portion of the Virginia law which held that burning a cross is prima facie evidence of intimidation.
Do you
That
think
is
there can
somewhat
be
troubling.
such a thing as non-intimidating cross-burning?
I don't know of any. Every time that I've ever read or heard about...
This is the first time you agree with Clarence Thomas.
I actually do. He actually wrote a pretty good dissent on this question.
And this is going to lead to some interesting jury questions and maybe some more discussion. And of course, there's more for us to talk about, but it turns out that's it for this special edition of Due Process. But we're going to be back next week with part 2 of our exclusive interview with Peter Harvey. Our thanks to the Attorney General Designate and to all of you for watching. For Sandy King and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. See you next week.
Has that contact ever been made to you to influence your decision as the acting and prospective Attorney General of the state of New Jersey?
The answer is no, Senator. I think that anyone that you ask, whether on the record or off in the governor's office, will tell you that I don't discuss investigations with them. And I made it very clear the day I came down here that I was not going to discuss any criminal matter with anybody, any political figure of any kind. And I wanted to make it clear that that's what you got when you got me. That people in this town will find out about indictments when we bring them. The governor's office finds out about criminal cases the same time the public finds out about them. They don't get advance word on a single case, and they never will.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,